very vibrant and pretty and red.
Thank you.
Yes.
Trying to make up for how I feel.
It's tough when you have a little one. And as a friend of mine used to say, low to the ground covered in germs, right?
Yeah. Well, you know what? We were pretty good until she started daycare. She was perfectly fine. And I thought everyone was exaggerating when they said that it would be bad. And it's been bad. She's been sick twice. So we've all been sick twice. But yeah, we're getting there.
Well, and my kid never went to daycare, but yet he was perpetually sick too. So this is the school system thing. So and that's when they're the most cuddly too, right? When they're just little ones, and that's when they want me the most. And
I know
it's tough.
Yeah, I know. I hear you on that.
You must also, with a pandemic, anytime something, it's like, do I have, I know
everyone's worried about COVID. I'm just worried about this like cough and cold business. So.
Oh, the poor little lammy. I can't believe. Okay, so let's get right. I'm going to introduce you, everybody who's watching, because I'm so excited. I read your book cover to cover yesterday.
Oh my God, already?
I know. I just went right through it. I was
wow.
I know. Okay, so we are talking today. I mean, of anybody who's changed careers, you've had quite the spectrum. So so we're going to talk about changing careers in the midst of a pandemic, and also being an accidental entrepreneur. And so Serena, in addition to becoming a new mom shortly before the pandemic started, you're the president and CEO of multi-award-winning event staffing and XM agency Tigris, which I always want to say Tigris, but it's Tigris Events.
Tigris, yeah, Tigris.
You became a licensed realtor over in the past 2 years as well, and is it only been like 2 weeks? You just launched your book.
That's right. Yeah. I just officially announced it last week, but it officially launched on October 28th. I just hadn't told anyone yet.
Yeah. So, which is exciting. Yeah. Cause I think the last I don't know if it was, the last I saw you, we went for dinner or lunch. But I think a couple times before that I remember being in your car and you telling me all these stories about your life. And I'm like, girl, you need to write a book. And now you're like, well, now I have. So
yeah, exactly. That's what so many people have been telling me for so long. And as you saw, it starts at the very beginning. And there's a lot of crazy things that happen early on. So I think just over the years, people had always said that to me, like, you've got to put this down on paper. You've got to write a book. And, obviously when you add in the whole business owner component to it, there's lots of learnings through all of that as well. So I just turned it into now what it is, the accidental entrepreneur.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. And it's a great legacy, for you, your daughter and your family too, to like, it's really kind of biography of your life journey, not even just as an entrepreneur, but just how you've navigated through all these things. And I know you're much younger than I am. And so I've always been wildly impressed with how successful you are and how confident you are as a business owner, as a leader. You've done a lot of leading, owning, like running teams and things like that. So the one thing I definitely learned from your book is you hustle. I mean, anybody out there that has worked harder than you insofar as like you're running a business and you're still working part-time doing other things. I don't know where you had all the energy to do all that, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things they say, like, no one's more productive than a busy mom in some ways. So I was really, I think, try to be productive and efficient before, but now that I have a little one dividing my time, it's not just my time anymore. Using her nap times. I'm very lucky that my husband's got a flexible schedule. So when I was studying for my real estate exams, for example, I would take 2 mornings a week to just study and then sometimes in the evening and all of that, although I'm not as efficient in the evening as I am in the morning. I'm definitely like a morning person. So I think just prioritization, sometimes if work did come in or quotes did come in and stuff like that, it might derail what you're planning to do. But obviously during COVID, we had 6-7 months of lockdown when there was not too much going on. Things picked up a little bit for a few months, and then we had another 7 months of lockdown. So I had way more time than I've had compared to over the years. So I wanted to make use of that time. Like I wrote this book going back a few years ago, and I just kind of hit a wall. I'm like, I got to get this done. And then the other real goal was the real estate license. So obviously I think the pandemic showed that events are not pandemic proof. We're obviously not considered essential, but real estate is. So I wanted to make sure that I had a backup plan if this is something that wasn't going to go away or if it wasn't going to go away anytime soon. and it was complementary to what I'd been doing already on the investment side. So it was a natural progression to move into that as well.
Yeah, I don't know how you've managed all of this, because as I said, like reading your book, I was already wildly impressed with how, when we met, you were you're running and your own business, Tigris Events. And so before I start to explain a little bit about Tigris Events and how that, well, not just how it came to be, but what was that all about?
Yeah, for sure. So I had been going through school for journalism. I thought I was going to be a hotshot reporter, and that was really my main pursuit. But I had been doing events part-time all the way through school, and then I got recruited into Tigris. So the woman that had started Tigris, I'd worked for her very temporarily a couple of years before. She left the company that she hired me through, and ultimately started Tigris, another division called New Age Solutions, and IOP Marketing Groups Limited, as well as a stag company. So started all these things. Called me up and said, hey, do you want to come over to my new company? So I was just finishing up school and I started part-time, and then the opportunity kind of came up that she wanted a full-time manager, and that led into partnership a little while after that. And then 4 years later, she decided to leave the company for personal reasons, which I go through in the book. So it really kind of happened by accident. Like I never had this big dream of owning my own company, but opportunity after opportunity kind of presented itself, and I just took them. And even when I was faced with her leaving, at the time we were heading into kind of a worldwide recession, but I had to decide, like, is it better to walk away? Should I go get a job somewhere, or do I take this risk and buy her out? So it took a bit of time, but I was able to accomplish that. And I've been running the company on my own for the last, I guess, 13 years. So everyone's like, how old are you? Because the business is almost 18 years old, but it's kind of a funny joke that I have sometimes with people when they ask that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that was so surprising to me that you were doing so much when we first met. I think we've probably known each other, gosh, like
it's been a few years at this point. Yeah,
it's been a few years, and to know the breadth of like what you were doing and like the events that you have been responsible for haven't been small feats. They've been pretty big.
I know, when I look back, I'm like, how did anyone trust us to do this? Like, even my account managers sometimes when they've gone through our old documents and they're like, you see the progression of like how we do things now compared to how we once did them. And it is funny because at the time, you do the best you can with what you have. And at the end of the day, we were delivering our clients' objectives and stuff like that. But at the same time, like, I'm like, oh, these protocols look terrible. Or, we weren't using PowerPoint, we we're using Word. And, things have come a long way when it comes to stuff like that. And even the systems and how we approach things and stuff like that has changed a lot.
Well, and I think that that's so impressive too. And how most people would say to be an entrepreneur, it requires a lot of risk. And what I can see, I never, going into my own self-employment journey, certainly wasn't a risk-taking thing. I transitioned when I was on mat leave. For you were 18, 19 years old going, okay, it just sounds like there were calculated risks. Obviously, they were very successful for you because you continue to grow and evolve and learn so much. And you just have this can-do attitude where it sounds like, from what I was reading in your book, basically anybody would throw something at you and you're like, I got this.
Or if you don't, you say yes and you try to figure it out. Like there are some times that, we didn't necessarily land those opportunities. I talk about some of the wins and some of the losses. But at the same time, I think we just would do anything that we had to do to make it happen. And I think the biggest challenge in what we do is the fact that we depend on other people to go out and do a really good job. So even though you could spend hours and hours planning something, if someone decides they don't feel like going to work that day or they're sick or something happens, you have to drop everything and try to find a solution. So I think we've tried to do the best we can under those situations that can be really difficult, and they can sometimes cost you a client if you're not able to deliver, or even if, for example, you get someone but they're an hour late and you're thinking, well, you should be very glad you're able to get someone there, but the client may look at it in a certain way. So I think, we've definitely tried really hard. Like no matter what the situation was, we've always really tried.
Well, and especially in an industry that isn't, I've sort of grown up with a lot of people that I know that work in hospitality, and that isn't something that people, I hate to say this, but staff aren't always the most reliable when it comes to hospitality too. And somehow you've been able to sort of figure out how to make that work when,
well,
it's
not always easy.
What do you mean?
It's not always easy. I mean, we have quite an elaborate onboarding plan that we have for bringing people on in terms of how we interview them, explain what they can come to expect from us while working for us, but also we expect from them. But you have to know that you're working with this age group that tends to be, on average, 18 to 25. There are now a lot of opportunities. The industry has become very mainstream. So if they all of a sudden get an opportunity where, I can work 3-4 more hours than this other opportunity, then people don't necessarily think twice about canceling. So we do have certain procedures in place for informing us of certain things. But again, we do try to always have more people on our team than we need so that we can troubleshoot issues if someone can't make it to work.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, I guess, having you really started in the hospitality industry yourself. So, what it's like. And, I mean, it sounds to me that you've always been responsible though. You couldn't run your business if you were just like, I'm just not going to show up to work today.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can never really turn it off, right? When you're in events, so you just never know. And even for clients that have emailed us, sometimes it could be a prospect and they could email us at, 9 o'clock at night or at 5 in the morning, whatever it may be. But I think what they've appreciated from us is that even if I don't get them a quote at 9 o'clock at night on a Friday, I'll say, I've gotten your email. I understand what you're looking for. I'll have you a quote by this time tomorrow. Right. And just even managing their expectations in a certain way has landed us a lot of business just because other companies would reply to them like a week later. It's actually surprising to me that companies operate that way. And, it's ideally led to a client that becomes a repeat client in the long term. So it's surprising to me that more companies don't necessarily operate that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think in the events industry too, I mean, I've known some young people that have thought, oh, well, this is my dream job to work. And I think they think it's going to be party time all the time. Having had a little bit of a taste of what you do when I started the very first, I think I told you this, my very first foray into entrepreneurship, I started something called Diaper Disco. I rented out a nightclub in Durham and turned it into a daytime disco when my guy was little. And I realized it's not for the faint of heart. Being an event planner, being an event management it's so much like you're white knuckling the entire time because there's so many contingencies. There's so many things that can go wrong.
Yeah.
So I realized it wasn't for me. Not at all.
Yeah, there's definitely things that can and will go wrong. Like I think weather sometimes can be one of the biggest challenges. Like we've had situations where, parts of tents and signage has blown over and like landed on people. Like we had our paid duty officer run over at an event. Like we've had so many crazy things and you just ideally learn from them. And sometimes you put in additional measures for next time. And even with the agreements that we have, sometimes we've added different clauses because, 10 years in, something just may not have happened like that before. And then all of a sudden it happened. You're like, we need to put this down so a client understands like how you handle it if it were to come up.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, and that's just like, you're just constantly learning, which has been,
Absolutely.
I think, kind of a theme for you.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what everyone goes through in their life. But as an entrepreneur, I think you really, you take your own learnings, but ideally you want to learn from other people and, what you can do. I think I built a lot of relationships with other entrepreneurs or business owners, and it's interesting to see like how they handle certain things, and especially like dealing with their own internal employees, like what motivates them or how do they keep them long term, or what happens when they do have to let somebody go, like how is that process handled and stuff like that, because those are some of the hardest things that you'll go through when you run your own business. So I think it's really great to always bounce those ideas and things off of other people just so you can learn from them as well.
Well, I think it's for any leader too. I found that most of my friends that are in senior leadership positions, they say the toughest thing is really managing people. It's, I can do the job, but having to manage people has really been one of the most difficult aspects of it for sure, because everybody's different. Everyone's got different challenges and so forth. And it just like, which you go through a lot in your book about the relationships you've had and you've had a lot of struggles. You've had to struggle a lot with a lot of and manage all of that. So having said so how do you juggle all of this? Like, you're wearing so many hats and a new mom to boot. I mean, how does all that work?
Yeah, I think I just try to, it's good that we have smartphones these days. So there's a lot that I can do to multitask. I try to, be present with my daughter when I can, but you can obviously check in and see if anything's important. When it comes down to the event stuff, at least working from home, like it doesn't really matter where we are. A lot of what we do is from your phone and computer anyways. So that's been no problem to manage, even as now we've started to pick back up. The real estate stuff has been, I'm building my foundation for that right now. I haven't been out there selling just yet because I've been waiting to get my daughter in daycare and all of that. But ideally, I'm working on kind of transitioning into that as we head through to the beginning of the new year. I think it's a lot about multitasking, prioritization, just managing your time effectively and working as quickly as you can.
And hopefully getting some sleep in there somewhere.
Yeah, for sure.
And so what made you decide to get into real estate? Like that was I think it was so cool to see the emergence of that in your career, considering you've had to sort of, the word is pivot, right? Everyone's saying pivot during the not the Ross pivot. Yeah. so many people have had to change. And I mean, it's not as if you had much choice with the event industry. So when did you get into real estate?
Oh, well, for sure. I guess it started early on. I talk about buying an investment property in the States. And at the time, I had a business coach that was saying, you've got too much retained earnings. Like most companies operate on 3 months. You've got like a year and a half's worth. And I think that was when you talk about risk. I never wanted to take out more than I really needed. So I let savings accumulate within the business. And I always felt comfortable knowing, like, no matter what, if we don't make any sales for like a long time, like I can always cover these costs. And she just said that was a waste. So I started thinking of ways that I could invest. I had always been a big believer in real estate, and I like the tangibility of it. Obviously, it tends to go up and up. Not to say it can never go down, but it tends to be a little bit more secure in my eyes. So I started looking into investment properties here, but it felt like I couldn't afford anything that would be really decent or worth it. So at the time, the dollar was par. The market in Florida had really collapsed and hadn't entirely rebounded at that point in time. So I started looking into options down there. I had to be creative with how I financed it because I actually couldn't qualify for a mortgage in Canada or in the United States because I'm a Canadian citizen and I'm buying in another country. So I had to be creative in terms of...
And a small business owner.
And a small business owner. The banks do not like me, let's just say that. So I had to be really creative with how I pulled the funds together. So I took some from the business, some from a home equity line, and some from savings. And then as I ended up paying down my home line, I just replaced that into the business and then paid it down again. So I basically bought and paid for the condo in a span of about 4 years. And during that time, I rented it out to snowbirds. We went down to check up on it and stuff like that. And then the dollar, when it eventually kind of went back to normal and it was about 30 cents on the dollar, I ended up selling. So I was able to do very well with our investment at that point. And then I just kind of happened upon an organization that we were doing some events for, ironically, in Texas and in Florida, even though they are based from here in Ontario. And I didn't know a lot about them, but I kept on seeing that they were having a wealth tour here in Toronto. And I was like, you know what, I'm just going to go and check them out. And I was just immediately intrigued. They talked a lot about generating all these passive sources of income, and everything was real estate centered. So I signed up for a 3-day course, and then from the 3-day course, signed up for their membership and had a coach. And then through that, ended up learning about all kinds of great things like syndicated mortgages, private lending, pre-construction, land development, like all these different things. And I basically just took the money that I had saved and divided it into all these different places. And at the time, I just thought, I'm building for the long-term future. And who would have thought that COVID would have happened like a year to a year and a half later? So now that I look back on it, like that's kind of what's made this not quite as stressful as it could have been, because I had all these passive sources of income coming in when my business literally just stopped. I mean, we lost like $1 million of business in our pipeline, about 300,000 in booked business. It got canceled all in the span of a week. So it could have been a really, really horrible situation. I'm not going to say it's been a walk in the park, but at the same time, I was smart enough going back to 2018 to be proactive with the money that I had earned on my investment and stuff like that at that point to put it into other things. So I'm just trying to build on that from this point.
I think what was what's so impressive to me, because of having read your book and realizing that, I like most people, I mean, some people will have the money sort of, the parents would help them sort of ladder up. You've done this all on your own. I mean, you've managed this. You're a self-made girl.
Yeah, well, I think it's also, I think I've always learned, like, you kind of live on less than, like, I could potentially pay myself more, but I try to like live on less. Like, I don't necessarily need a whole lot. But as a business owner, like, we went through periods of time where we didn't pay ourselves for 6 months or 8 months or whatever that is. So at the end of the year, you could take a bonus of, I'd say bonus, you're kind of like back paying yourself. But if you're getting a lump sum, say, of $20,000, well, I'm getting by on my part-time job right now. I didn't necessarily need that money. So that was like half of my down payment. So in some ways, it's forcing you to save. Luckily, I was in a situation because I was young, like I was living with family and I still had expenses and I was still paying bills, but I didn't have a family. I didn't have a mortgage. Like I give people a lot of credit that are now my age, for example, that have a lot of overhead that are starting out. And I think that's what would make entrepreneurship so much harder. Or the businesses, for example, that have a lot of startup capital, like if you're starting a food brand, you have to have a facility, you have to have all these safety things, you need packaging. For us, we just really needed internet, a computer. And then we weren't necessarily, there was not necessarily any risk because you're not paying for anything until you're actually booking the business. If anything, you just have to be able to float payroll in some cases if clients don't pay you on time. But I do talk about how we handled that early on as well.
Yeah, there was so much that you have managed, from human resources to payroll to, there's so much. It's really, as I said, not really for the faint of heart at all. Because, I think what you've done and how I'm really impressed. I just think you're one of those amazing people. And I love the learning in your book even more about sort of behind the scenes of sort of what went into what makes Serena Serena. So it's you're remarkable. I hope you recognize how remarkable you are. And yeah, so now that you're sort of moving into like real estate and so forth, and we met because I can't even remember, quite frankly, how did we meet?
Yes, I can't remember the exact event, but you were talking at it when you mentioned that you're from Bowmanville. I was like, wow, I never meet people from Durham region.
Yeah,
I can meet this woman. So I remember just coming up to chat with you after the event. I feel like we hit it off, and then obviously we went to a couple of events at that point, and it just kind of went from there.
Well, and then you invited me to speak at the American Marketing Association, and then that parlayed me into meeting more new people. And so it's really kind of neat how, like we've used that word a couple times, but just how lovely it's been that, networking and finding those people like yourself that have helped me in my career for sure. So thank you for that. And so networking obviously has been a really big part of your career as well, right?
Yeah,
so
for sure.
That's how you have built your business, because you have been in the hospitality industry even before you built your business. You started off doing hospitality, and then it was sort of laddered up from there. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, for us in the first 8 years, everything was built on referrals. Some of the clients my partner kind of found just through her parents, her mom's insurance company that she worked with ended up being a client, and she was very much the hustler. Like, I don't look at myself quite in that way, where she could just be that charismatic person to just go in and people would trust her, and then she kind of slide in stuff about the business, where I'm not necessarily comfortable in that sense to handle business that way. But that is how we kind of built things up initially. And then in the last, I guess it'd be probably like eight-ish years, it's really been more through SEO. So we lost a really big client. We were already kind of losing them throughout 2011, but by the beginning of 2012, we knew they're gone, we've lost them. And they were probably about 65% of our sales. So I knew we have to do something or we could be in a lot of trouble. So we started doing search engine optimization. And I do talk about that in my book, being probably the number one regret that I have in business, because someone talked to us about it in 2005 and we were like, oh, we're fine. And we didn't really even understand what he was probably trying to talk to us about. And at the time we didn't even have a website, but had we been doing it then, I can only imagine how things could have exploded. But really for us now, it's even just before I got on this interview, someone emailed us looking for a quote for some girls for a trade show. And, earlier today we were doing a quote for some sampling and hand out free pizzas over the course of the month leading up to Christmas. So people you want to be available to the people that are finding you. So beyond that, you want to build those relationships, and can start off very transactional. But once you are working with them, you want to get to know those clients. So they may start out as an online lead, but eventually you want to take them out for coffee or have lunch with them. Obviously the COVID things are a little bit different, but we try to build the relationships as much as we can at that point.
Yeah, I find that SEO is one of those things where actually quite just transparently, not that many people will say that's been a huge part of their career insofar as getting new leads. And I think a lot of people think that that's the end all be all. And I think your business might be a little more rare, because it's really, for me, what I find is the sales and building and so forth really has to do with those relationships as opposed to SEO. But I was really impressed and interested to hear more about the SEO aspect of your business, and also not being sort of swindled by snake oil salesmen, because there's a lot of people out there, oh yeah, I can get you on front page SEO, blah blah blah, and they really can't, for a lot of different reasons. But obviously the person that you worked with, or you've worked with more than one person, I guess.
We've worked with a few at this point. Initially, it's kind of like finding any service provider. You want to do your research, narrow it down to your top 3, and then you land on one. So we found one guy, and there was some things that, looking back, I would have done a little bit differently. We talked about changing the business name at that point, and I was very hesitant. Where we should have just done it, because ideally you want to start that when you're doing SEO in the beginning. But again, from a branding perspective, it took time to transition all of that stuff over. I couldn't even tell you everything that he did because he didn't really tell us. But we went from having like one call probably every few weeks to like 2 to 3 calls every single day. Wow. And we were just like, even just keeping up with the pace sometimes could be really difficult because sometimes it could be very simple, straightforward quote. Other times it's like a 100-page RFP for something really big. Like I remember quoting on something for the TTC and it was like, I think it came in at $3 million or something like that. Even like dropping our prices down like to $15 an hour and we'd only be making a couple dollars an hour per staff, it still came in at like a few $1,000,000. So there could be like very, very sizable opportunities. But the one that I talk about in the book was, where it really felt like it was starting to pay off. We had one company that's a supplier of like drywall and drywall compound, and they're one of the biggest suppliers in the whole world. They read a blog that we wrote about work that we had done with Rona, and they just signed back like a $250,000 contract without even meeting us. Like we just sent them the quote and then they just signed it back. And I was like I remember the girl had working for me being like, they signed it. We're like, oh my gosh. And it was like the big turning point for us because we'd had a couple of years where, we were just either slightly at a loss or just at a break even. And all of a sudden things started to really escalate. So sales doubled and then they kept on going up like 25-30% year over year beyond that. And it was just the pace of quotes that kind of came in. Like when we started doing SEO, maybe we did 100 quotes in the year. And before COVID, I think our last year was like close to 800 quotes. So every year it was growing incrementally, like 100 quotes every single year, year over year. And then you're booking, X percentage of that. And sometimes it could be really big things for people that are all over the world. Like lots of companies in the States, like the government of South Australia booked a trade show with us, companies from Europe. Like I even had dinner in Greece with a couple clients that had booked us for business here and, things like that. So it was just really amazing to see like where people were finding us. And the trick is really, you just want to be available for the people finding you. So you want to be on the first page of Google for, as many keywords as possible. And then at that point, once they do contact you, you've obviously got to like get back to them quickly. You've got to be competitive in your pricing and you've got to be able to do the work. But really a big part of it for us, we don't depend on walk-by traffic because our staff could be anywhere in the entire country. So it really just is contingent on what people are looking for when they're searching for you.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Yeah. So you kind of mentioned too, like we talked a little bit about success. Obviously, you've created quite a name for yourself in a bunch of different, not just one industry, but now you're moving into other industries as well. So there's one quote that I have taken courses in neurolinguistic programming. So the reframe that I have about failure is there is no failure, there's only feedback. And so what kind of failure or feedback have you learned throughout your journey? Because I know that that's a good part. Like at the very end of your book, there is those. Here's the lessons learned. I think there's I can't remember how many of them, at least 10.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a lot. Like I definitely feel like I've made my fair share of mistakes and stuff like that. And I talk about that from the standpoint of dealing with employees and with clients and stuff like that. I think the biggest one was when we had a client come to us. It was a client that we had worked with before, we knew and trusted, and they wanted to book like a very massive campaign with us. And it was only on a 6 weeks lead time. So we kind of trusted like it's going to go ahead. Of course it's going ahead. And, started working on it like day in, day out for a few weeks. And I think the project was worth about $500,000. And then 3 weeks in, they had to cut it back from 500,000 down to 100,000. And at the end of the day, they're like, be glad that it wasn't canceled. But really, it was just, you have to have that signature on everything. So for me, it was like, I felt it was a catch-22. If I didn't start on it, but it did go ahead, I'd be really screwed if I only had 3 weeks of lead time. But then at the same time, I wasted 3 weeks because I didn't have that signature. So learning stuff like that was really important. And there are other times that I talk about in the book where, again, I didn't have that physical signature and it came back to bite us after the fact when the client kind of went in a different direction. And I think just also dealing even with employees, there's been a lot of things that looking back, I wish I, could have done differently in some capacities. But from that, we try to like learn from those experiences and be better and be a better leader or better manager to new people that you bring on the team afterwards. But I think client relationship is so important. I think how you communicate with someone or like the last impression that you have with them means the world. So I think just really trying to be very protective and careful with all of those relationships, no matter what it is. Even when I think about some of those, I think you try to do the best that you can, but at the end of the day, like you have to have those clients responding to you. Like sometimes we have had staff or clients that, they ghost you completely. So you don't even have the chance to explain or add some perspective to the situation that happened. And it is what it is. But I think, again, you just try to learn and you pick up yourself up and dust yourself off. And, there's always going to be more clients, right?
Yeah, and I think, to your point, the one thing that seemed to be repeated, like it was a good repetition in your book, was really about get things documented, get things signed for that same thing. Sure, you can have people say, yes, go ahead with it, and that will happen more often than, I think it happens a lot.
Yeah, it happens a lot. Like, or people come to you on a super short notice, and like they're like, this is going ahead, this is going ahead. So you kind of start to do stuff, and then they're like, oh, actually, this happened and we can't go ahead anymore. And you're like, but you're just frantic. Like, we dropped everything to help you, but then all of a sudden, like, something changes, right? So we have seen that time and time again, but it is what it is. I think when I look at my future career in real estate that I'm working on, like, I think at the end of the day, you really, really have to have everything meticulously documented, and you have to be so careful. Like, people are making the biggest investments in their lives. So I think everything that I've learned up until this point will be a really great foundation for that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So one of the reasons why I started this whole podcast in the first place was really because I found that a lot of my clients and my friends, and just having these sort of intimate conversations with people, that they're afraid of sort of putting themselves out there. And I thought, well, okay, that I can talk about that, because it's something that I've struggled with. I continue to struggle with, even having, like yourself, written a book, after having been on television and those kinds of things. And yet I still struggle with imposter syndrome all the time. So how did you, was it just sort of natural? Like you said, you became an accidental entrepreneur, but you had to have a certain level of confidence that you knew that you could get it done. So like, how do you know you can put yourself out there and sort of just do it? Like, are you terrified every time you make one of these decisions, or is it just sort of been?
I think it depends on what it is. Like, I think when I look at some of the areas where we're not as strong, like in this business, you need to really like show your ideas. You can't just like tell about them. So I think that's been something that sometimes we feel maybe not quite as confident with. Like, we can tell a client all about what we want to do, but we don't have enough money necessarily to have an in-house graphic design person, and it can cost like thousands of dollars to get a rendering done. So those would be some of the situations where maybe we don't have quite as much confidence going into, or if there's like a lot of technology and stuff like that. That being said, we do have a lot of suppliers that we work with, and we try to work in tandem with them. If there is something that we're not sure that we can help with, we'll try to, work with them in partnership to make something happen for a client. But earlier on, when I was just young, like I had maybe 4 or 5 years, I guess, promotional event experience under my belt when I started working in the office. And having done that, like I kind of knew from a staff's perspective what was important. And that's how we started designing things like our event protocols, our invoicing templates and stuff like that, because the agency that I worked with actually had no training. She never provided anything like that. Any information was provided by phone or text. So sometimes things could be offered to you that would later be retracted. And I never just wanted to be like that with our staff. I wanted to always be very, very clear, like, this is what you're expected to do. This is your compensation, when you're going to get paid, how you're going to get paid, all of these different things. At the end of the day, if there's ever a conflict, you can go back to that and be like, well, this is where it's all communicated. And that's how staff come to depend on us, and how we build these relationships where staff work for us for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Like, we've got people that have been with us for so long, and it's because they know that they can really depend on us, and like how we treat them, how professional we are, and things like that. And it's just taking a lot of those learnings, like what I liked, what I didn't like from different agencies, and trying to incorporate it into like what we're doing. But I can't say, I don't know. It felt like there's no like I never necessarily felt like I was putting myself out there. I just was trying to help people. Like, if a client came to us, like, you always want to deliver what they need. And it was always kind of coming from that place of resourcefulness, or like, how can I help you? And it sounds silly, but really that mattered to me more than trying to like make the sale, or just bring in the business and stuff like that. If it's really not a fit, like, we have one client we send a lot of opportunities to, because I'm like, you know what, they're experts at this. I think they'd be far more suited to you. And like, I'd rather just pass it along than try to figure it out myself and book it for us.
Right. Yeah. And it sounds to me like process was a big part of having been there. Sort of, you did the undercover boss backwards, right? Not backwards. You did it the right way. You had the experience that then sort of parlayed into, I treat my staff the way that I would have wanted to have been treated.
Yeah.
When I was in that role, and getting paid was important.
Yeah. And it's amazing, because there are a lot of agencies that do exploit the staff working for them, that either don't pay them, take many, many months to pay them if they pay them. And like, it's really sad that some agencies have operated that way. And obviously they don't have staff staying with them in the long term and stuff like that. But I don't know, for me, it was always so important. I do talk about that even in the book, like how we came up with a way to make sure that we could always like get that payment out to staff on time and stuff like that. It was always just super, super important to me personally.
Because you couldn't, I mean, you certainly couldn't be managing the breadth of the events that you have if you didn't have process in place, if you weren't organized, if you weren't.
Yeah, and some of that came along. Like I worked with a mentorship group in 2016, and they kind of forced us to create playbooks for every position in our business. So yes, we had ways that we trained staff, but it wasn't nearly as systematic as it is now, where literally for every single position in our company, we have a playbook identifying not only what has to happen, but how. So like it screenshots the entire process of like how you would reach out to collect availability from staff, or if you're planning an event, how to do a work back, so that when we did train new people, like, yes, they have a lot to review, but they can always reference back to this. So they are learning from someone and shadowing, but they can just jump in. And we just found we were training people that much more quickly. Like usually in 2 to 3 weeks, they're rolling with it and planning their own events, where before that it could take them a lot longer, and it's all kind of like hands-on. But then the other thing is that we wanted the consistency. So if we have 5 people planning an event for us and someone's sick all of a sudden, I want to make sure that the other person jumping in for them knows exactly what they're looking at, because we're all doing things the same. So it was just trying to come up with those systems and processes in a way that made sense for everybody. And if there ever was a time that, someone jumped in and something didn't make sense, it's because they strayed from like our process. We're like, well, you skipped a step, so then this happened, and then there's a ripple effect, right? But we definitely tried to implement that as much as we could.
I'm curious to know, because I don't have a team or staff. I have worked with other subcontractors. Is it hard? Was it hard in the beginning for you to delegate anything? Because I know that you're very organized. You're very efficient at what you do. And then sometimes if someone else drops the ball, how can you delegate and not be terrified that the person that you're working with is going to not maybe be up to the same standards that you are?
Yeah, it was really hard. Like I'd say probably for the first. So when my partner left, I was brought in for operations, so I did most of the planning. And then I did have a full-time staff almost right away, but we kind of divided up the work. I was still planning events probably up until about 2014. So that was probably about 6 years. And I found it really, really hard. Like I would definitely, sometimes it was a Saturday, I'd be like, oh, I'll just go in their email and I'll just help save some feedback forms or do this. And I'm thinking like, I'm giving us a leg up on the week. And who knows how they necessarily felt, like if I was interfering or if I didn't trust them to do the job or whatever it was. And it was not necessarily malicious or anything like that. I just knew we had a busy week ahead, and I would try to like start getting things done. And, I found it just, it was very, very hard to be a little bit more hands off. And then I had a mentor that's like, you have to get your hands off this stuff. Like stop doing your own bookkeeping. You need to stop planning events. You need to, come up with these ways to teach people so that you're just the person they're bouncing ideas off of, or whatever that may be. And that will help you to focus on sales and to grow. And that's really when we started to have a lot more growth. It was kind of in tandem with the SEO stuff as well. But that's how we started kind of growing our team from that point on. But it was definitely challenging. I'm not going to lie about that.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And as you said, that's the other thing I think about entrepreneurship that people don't necessarily know is like, and I remember when I used to work at Wedding Bells, some of my my clients would say, you think it's going to be so much easier going on your own because you see, working for, the man or however you sort of want to frame it. You're like, I could do this on my own. And then you realize actually, instead of working 9 to 5, you're working 5 to 9, you're working weekends, you're working night.
You never really turn it off. Yeah.
Yeah. And in the hospitality,
don't teach you how to do it either, right? Like if you work for a company, like they probably have a lot of these things in place, where a lot of the stuff that we do now, like you have to either, again, you're figuring it out as you go. Like there's not like some big manual teaching you how to do these things or handle these situations and stuff like that. So I think that's been probably one of the biggest challenges, is just trying to figure out like, how do we do this? Or as you do grow, okay, well, this was fine at this stage. Well, now how do we do it at this stage? And figuring those kinds of things out. And there have been, things that haven't necessarily worked out. Like we tried to build our own software platform. We spent a lot of money doing it. Had it worked out, it would have been amazing. But I had to finally put my foot down, and we couldn't put more money into it because it wasn't necessarily going to be worth it at that point in time. But we had to walk away. Like we spent about $70,000 and we ended up walking away from it. But there was nothing on the market that did it the way that we wanted to see it. And really it came down to how you look at availability. Everything showed like a shift view, not like a complete view. And you have to think, if you're planning a project for an entire month, you kind of need to know like who has the best availability. And if you can only look at it shift to shift to shift, that could be really complicated. So we had a really big grand master plan as to like how it would work, but there was all these kinks in it. The staff weren't necessarily adopting it. It can't work if they're not in it and they're not using it. So there was like a combination of things as to why it didn't work out. But, it was just definitely, so kick in the pants that I had to absorb that it wasn't going to work out, but we tried. The thought was, well, if we do this on our own, then it's something that we own. Maybe we can even resell it later on, where a lot of the softwares are like $3,000 a month. So we're like, we could own it as opposed to paying this like long-term fee, right? So yeah, it doesn't always work out, but you try.
Well, and I think the lesson I learned from your book too is like making those calculated risks. So you did, you have to make quick, like it sounds to me that in your career throughout, they have been sort of quick decision, like you make quick decisions, but they're not done without having thought it through as well.
Absolutely.
So you do take a lot of risks. You're a girl who takes risks. There's no doubt about it.
It's nothing like even with the real estate investments, for example, I'm not going to take every single penny I own and put it into the one thing. Like even with the money that I have invested, it's like a small percentage of what I would have access to. I'm making whatever on it, but I know like if I lost that all tomorrow, like I can make that back in a year or two. I'm not going to like lose my home over it. I'm not going to put myself in like dire straits over it. But if I can make all this money in the meantime and take that calculated risk, then it's worth it. I think people run into hot water where they do maybe too much, and you just have to weigh those pros and cons and know what you're comfortable with and like what you can handle if it does go sideways.
So the most of the learning, like you said, you did have mentors and you did hire a business coach at one point. But most of the learning sort of been you just is it trial and error? Has that sort of been really?
Yeah, I think altogether I've had 2 or 3 coaches, like a mentoring group, and then a couple mentors. So there's been quite a lot since about 2012. And then also just trying to learn from like other people's mistakes. But a lot of it, yeah, it's just as it happens. Like, you could be doing things for 10 years one way, and then all of a sudden something comes up. It makes you look at it from a different perspective. So I think, and also the world evolves. Like the technology today is very different than how it once was. Like we used to do a lot of like in-person large group interviews, but then we were starting to get so many requests for places like all over the country that we started to do a lot more interviews virtually. And it's the same thing. You're still having the chance to see how they present themselves, like how do they communicate. I think we still would want to replicate the group environment to see like who stands out. Like if there's 10 people you're talking, like who really shines? Because for us, we want the people that shine. Like we want the people that are amazing. So I think that you do adapt in different ways, and it can make you efficient in different things, because we're not covering the cost of like boardrooms in all these cities and managers' time to go out and do those things, and just trying to figure out different ways to do things, which has made our lives a little bit easier. But as time has shifted and things change, then you change a little bit as well.
Well, fingers crossed we're starting to head back into real life. In some ways, right? I think it's going to be like, I think it's the way you're alluding to. In some ways, they're going to still be this sort of hybrid of, yeah, we can do some stuff online.
Yeah.
I mean, I think most of us are sort of, especially us extroverts. I mean, I'm not an introvert. Is getting out and seeing people again. I think I have some hesitancy towards it. I certainly like presenting from home. I think I love not having to commute. But at the same time, I do miss it's not the same when you're not in person. And I think the events that you have worked with in the past, like those experiences, that experiential networking and the experiential events that you in your business have done, you can't. There's just no way to do that virtually.
And a lot of people ask, like, did you adapt your business virtually? And for what we do, not really. Like we were never that company that did the huge conferences and those kinds of events. We've got a couple clients that did really, really well. Like their teams doubled during the pandemic because all their conferences became virtual. And then they started attracting all the conferences that other companies couldn't adapt to virtually. So some companies have done really, really amazing, but for what we do, it's not really suitable to do anything virtually. We have supported, even provided like support staff sometimes to those virtual events, but it just wasn't something that we could adapt to ourselves. So again, that's why I really started looking at real estate more closely. And I waited until, I guess it was about 2 months into the pandemic when I signed up for the program. But I think I couldn't see how Tigris would possibly do well in a virtual space. We didn't have the skill set for it. It just didn't make sense for us to try to like figure that stuff out on our own.
And what like a white knuckle time, because it was like, oh, after this, we're going to go back to in person. After this, we kept thinking like, okay,
Yeah.
we eventually going to get back. And I think it's now now that most of us have been vaccinated, we're starting to get more back into seeing. I mean, I even went to a concert, if you can believe it. I went to the Maroon 5 concert, and it was really kind of weird to be around like all those other people, maxed and all that other stuff. But it was still like, oh gosh. Whereas I know some of my other friends that are like running conferences and stuff like that, people still aren't ready to sort of embrace being in those bigger crowds. But
yeah, it all depends. Like we do have some clients and we've got different protocols in place that, for example, like if staff had any COVID exposure, like what we expect from them to let us know, and like what that happens, like how that affects our events and stuff like that. Or there were some situations where we had a lot of events booked for January and February, but we went into lockdown again. So we had already done all the work, but then the event couldn't happen. So we had to add certain terms into our agreements to allude to that, because we couldn't then just be out of pocket for everything that we'd done to plan the events. So in some cases, those events were canceled. Sometimes they were postponed. Like we had a market research study booked that just happened last week that was supposed to happen in January. So in some cases, we were able to finally conduct the work. But now going forward, we have certain policies in place with regards to PPE and just how staff should handle things. We just have those open, candid conversations with our clients so that they understand, we're at the mercy of the government and the health situation and stuff like that. And we're just trying to do what we can to move ahead safely. We haven't had any situations of exposure with our staff when they have been working, but a lot of things have picked up now where there's a lot of street sampling. We're getting requests for Christmas-oriented promotions and holiday things like that. But since about August, it's really started to turn a corner for us. So hopefully it's up and up from here.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. So one question I'd love to ask you is, do you think that women, like as a female leader yourself, have you had a harder time being a female, or do you think that women have a harder time?
I guess for me personally, I wouldn't say that I've experienced something where I found it challenging. A lot of the clients we work with, like the marketing managers or brand managers, are females. Like I wouldn't say that necessarily worked against us. There were a couple situations when I think back, like I had a meeting with kind of like an electronics company, and I walked into a boardroom with like 5 men, and at the time, like, I don't know, I was 25 or 26. So I did feel like maybe they were just a look in their eye, like weren't really totally taking me seriously. There's another meeting I had with one of my managers, and she just wasn't dressed as professionally as I would have liked going in, because you never know how people are going to dress. So you always kind of dress maybe more corporate because you just don't know. And I think it was one of those situations where they were corporate, I was corporate, but then she was kind of dressed down a bit. And you could just, again, get the impression that they weren't taking us seriously. And so I wouldn't say it was like a common thing. Sometimes it could have even been like my age, not necessarily gender or something like that, because I was young. And, you are dealing with these really big brands, and you're dealing with these big opportunities. Like there's a lot on the line when it comes to the return on their investment and stuff like that. So for me, I'd say no, but I could understand in some situations where people may encounter that.
Yeah. The same, I was going to say about the youth thing too, because I sort of, that's one of the reasons why I typically announce my age to people, especially when I was younger, because I did always look so young that I didn't want people to think that they, so I was kind of always like, hi, nice to meet you. My name is Leslie and I'm blankety blank years old. Was for that, because I did want people to take me seriously. Now that I'm getting older, it's like the opposite. I want people to think I'm younger. Because there is ageism. It's really strange how some of the clients that I have interviewed, they don't want dates on their LinkedIn profiles because they're nervous about sort of being aged out, which is unfortunate as well. So I think probably more ageism than sexism for sure. In that, and then people taking you seriously, and I would assume too. Again, we're bouncing all over the place. Is really like the behind the scenes stuff that you do that people. I mean, I would guess that that's probably like one of the biggest sort of misunderstood parts about your business is that people just think that you're going to just pay for when they show up.
Yeah. I think sometimes people don't necessarily have the same respect for time. So they don't necessarily always consider, like, if they want to go and change something 10 times, like a client may not realize what kind of a ripple effect that has if they keep changing dates and times. Because you have to think the staff that we're working with, like, they're not all sitting at their computers waiting for our emails. Like, they're out going to school and working other jobs and stuff like that. So, I think that's one thing. If I was to give advice to a client, like, ideally try to come in with as close to the right plan as possible, because all those changes just create so much more time for us. And, just dealing with the staff, that can be really, really difficult. But yeah, sometimes we have had to flag things to clients. Like if they, we worked with one client back in August, for example, they asked, I think, for about 30 things. And then they asked for a revision and they added about 55 things. So then we requoted all of that stuff. Then they took a whole bunch of stuff away again. And like just all that extra time to like go source all those items and take them away again. And luckily they understood like what they had asked for and they were okay covering the time. But we have had other clients that they wouldn't pay that extra time. Like they asked for all these extra things and they're like, okay, we'll pay all these hard costs, but not your time. So we have obviously added things in. So now as our word of thumb, like we try to flag it to the client, we're at 25% of the hours, 50% of the hours. So they can see like how quickly we're necessarily going through things, especially if they're adding things to the scope of the project or changing things. And sometimes it could be just nitpicking stuff, like trying to match a perfect color or, it just doesn't totally meet their expectation, but it's just all that back and forth does add up. So we try to just be really mindful to let them know.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they haven't sort of understood what goes into the behind the scenes, they, what in the agency world was always called scope creep, right? Of, okay, so we're just going to do this. And it's like, well, can you also, and they're expecting that all those changes, but they're just little changes.
Yeah.
To your point, it's like the butterfly effect, where like that one little thing that has this domino effect for all sorts of other things.
Yeah, for sure.
That, changing one thing on the scope of the project really does make a huge difference.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So launching your book, which is a huge accomplishment. So congratulations on that. It's very exciting. So, I think we've alluded to, I've got this question here, but like why you wrote it and why, and why do you think people will benefit from reading it? I think we've already talked about this, but I'm going to let you speak in your words about why did you write it?
Yeah, I guess, so obviously it kind of opens off with my childhood and, all the crazy things that happen at that point. But I think the important thing there is that, I knew that I couldn't necessarily depend on anyone to help me make my way. So it's not like I had anyone paying my university tuition. I was out there getting a job really young because I was living with extended families. So yes, they gave me the roof over my head and, there's food in the fridge, but if I had to get new clothes or if there was a class trip, like I always felt bad asking for anything more because they're already giving me so much. Like it wasn't like my parents were just like, hey dad, can I have $5? Or, you can't have that expectation on extended family the same way that you would on your own parents. So I think from an early age, I knew like, I've got to make my own money and I've got to make my own way and stuff like that. And it just, that built the foundation heading on into entrepreneurship. And I think because I was living with extended family, like I really wanted to have my own space. So buying a house was like literally priority number one when I finally started making some money. I just didn't want to be a burden on anyone else. And, I think those stories from the personal side and the business side, they're totally intertwined. And it's just kind of how it ended up that I ended up being an entrepreneur. If I ended up in the corporate world, I think I probably would have had some similar experiences in some ways, but it really came down to survival and, just trying to get ahead and build something better for yourself. Like I saw my mom struggle most of my life. And I just knew like, I don't ever want to be in this situation. And, even looking at my real estate license, like she had talked about getting her license at one point in time and didn't. And I think that even probably motivated me to get it because I'm like, it's just something that she talked about, didn't do. She didn't get out of her comfort zone, wouldn't invest in herself and didn't do it. And she could probably be in a much better place now if she had. So I think I just always wanted to continually be learning, investing in myself, trying to like build the future for myself, now building the legacy for my daughter. Like, if I can go out and buy 10 rental properties over the next 10 years and I can leave them all to her, just think about the long-term wealth that I can build within my family. And maybe when she eventually has kids down the road and stuff like that. So I think it's for the people that, maybe they're going through a challenge. Like I talk about love and loss and I talk about death and divorce and these family tragedies and stuff like that. And, there could be people that are going through something really rough and they just have to see like there's light at the end of the tunnel. You're going to come out okay on the other side. And don't just let yourself get sucked into, being like, whatever it may be. But there's kind of like that, the quote where it's like, well, why do you drink? There's the two brothers. And the one brother says, well, because my dad drank. And the other one says, well, I don't drink because my dad drinks. So they go in these two different directions, and you could have found those situations, or I could have found them where you could wallow in them and be like, I'm going to just let my life fall apart. But instead I looked at it like, well, no, I have to try that much harder to try to pull myself out and like rise up above those things. And I knew that no one was going to do it for me. Like if I don't go to work, well, who's going to pay my bills for me? Nobody is. So I think it was just looking at it in that way. And I do know other people that may have gone in a different direction, but for me, I just had to propel in that other direction all the time.
I love that you talk about that, because the one thing that I found is a lot of times that it's that adversity, to your point, like it's the adversity or that builds resilience a lot of times too. And it's sort of, if you hadn't had the life lessons, and you went through a really hard time as a kid, which is in the book as well. So just having to go through those struggles and then you're right. Like you could have just been, sitting on the couch and just being like, oh, woe is me. My life just dealt me there's an entrepreneur, she says it's a shit sandwich.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your life could have been, you could have said like, oh, woe is me, I had all this like rough stuff going on in my life, and so my life is going to be horrible. But you ended up blossoming and like not benefiting from it, but it's the adversity that really helped you ladder up, because you were like, no is not an answer.
Yeah.
I
just always tried to do everything like that. That meant, volunteering here and taking a job here and a job here. Like, my husband kind of jokes around that once upon a time, like my messenger name was like Busy Bambina. And he's like, I had to know why you're so busy all the time. And he's like, now I know, like just seeing, like I was always taking on more and like very much a yes person, just trying to like meet more people, have more opportunities. And, you never know what doors are going to open for you. Right. So I think even now the hard thing is having my daughter, my time's not necessarily my own. So sometimes you're like, I want to do this and this and this, but you have to be mindful of balance and where your responsibilities are. So there's been that shift for me personally, but at the same time, I just, even when I think of some of the part-time jobs that I had, even when Tigris was starting out, like, I met different clients at different events. And if I hadn't been there working as a staff, I never would have met them. And they became like really big long-term clients and stuff like that. And if it had just been my staff there, they probably never would have like talked about Tigris or referred us or anything like that. But just by putting myself out there into all these different situations, it led to all of these different things.
Yeah. And I think what's so cool too, and I'm just that much further ahead of you. My son has never known me in any other context of being self-employed. So I think it's kind of neat, because that's what he aspires to do on his own too. And I think that now in 2021, we are looking at where more people, I mean, even the government is trying to support entrepreneurs, small business owners, for various reasons. And so, while we have a little bit more say in our business and so forth, we are definitely being role models to the next generation in a way of like, do it. And I'm kind of excited about that, Serena, because I love to see that sort of the next generation, they're not as afraid of putting themselves out there as I certainly was, because I was always told, no, you sit down and shut up and do as you're told. To get a job, to sit down and shut up and do as you're told. The next generation aren't going to have necessarily the same fears or same expectations of sort of boxing themselves, and nobody's a lifer anymore with a certain job. So
yeah, no, I can understand that for sure.
Yeah. So how can people reach you? Or actually, before I say the last thing, so like, do you have any last words, a mantra, a belief, a motivational phrase? Like what sort of gets you through the tough times, or any kind of motivational, because you are a very positive person. So I'm sure you've got some really good advice.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I actually wrote down so I wouldn't forget it. What did I say? I think here, just again, like life is, again, I talk about it over and over in my book, but life is what you make of it. So I think that's probably number one. I think, if you want something, you have to go after it. Like nobody's just going to hand you something. I talk about my book at the very opening sentence that I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth, but it tarnished. So at the end of the day, you've got to get out there and polish it back up and kind of create those opportunities for yourself. And again, no one's going to do it for you. I think that's one of the challenges, maybe just looking at like the youth of today. It's like, if they are entitled, it's because the parents maybe gave them too much. I think for me, like, yes, it would have been nice to know if I wanted $5 for lunch, I could have borrowed it or been given it when I was younger. But because I wasn't, I think it really, really pushed me to want to have those things and, provide for myself and stuff like that. So I think it is important. And even looking at my daughter, I think that's something I'm going to always try to be mindful of, that I'm going to want her to try to work for some of these things. Like you can't make it too easy, or they will grow up not necessarily feeling like they need to work that way. And they might be able to provide for themselves or develop those skills. So I think that's really important.
That's awesome. And so one last question I have for you too, is because I'm sort of curious about your process. Insofar as like when it comes to sort of putting yourself out there, do you have those hesitancies? Do you just go, oh, just do it? Do you wait for a moment when you just feel more confident? Like what makes you take those leaps sometimes?
I guess it depends on the situation. Like if I'm out at a networking event, I'm terrible. Like I'm not the person to go and meet like 50 people. But once the ice is broken, I could probably sit there and talk to that person for like an hour straight. But I'm not great at breaking the ice or something like that. So I definitely don't like, I've never been the one to like the cold calling, even if it's a client, like if you catch them off guard, it could be like a really awkward conversation. So I think that's one reason that I really, really liked SEO for our business, because at the end of the day, when they reach you, they're already a warm lead. So if you call them up, you're like, I have this here. You're not calling them out of the blue. Like they want what you have. So it made it a lot easier. So that's why we really tried to do it that way. So we didn't really have to put ourselves out there in the same way that some people may consider doing that. Like if you're in car sales or even with real estate, they try to talk about doing that. I think at the end of the day, you just, again, want to come from a place of helping people. You don't want to push yourself on someone. You make it known what you do and how you do it. And if there's a fit and you want to work together, then great. If not, there might be another company that could be a better fit. So I think for me, that was just more my personal style. I never really wanted to like push ourselves too strongly on somebody, because I think that can really like turn somebody off as well.
Yeah, I'm like you. Even as an extrovert, I've said this so many times. I don't usually like networking.
Yeah.
Even as an extrovert, and I don't like doing the self-promotion thing. And sometimes it's just like, get out of your own way. Like I have to have these talks with myself. Like, get out of your own way. Get out of your own way, right? Because if I'm holding myself back from telling people what I do and how I can help, and to your point, being of service to people, if I'm holding myself back for fear of, what if somebody doesn't like me? What if someone thinks, who do you think you are? Then I'm doing a disservice to the people that I really want to help. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and like I said, I think once you do break that ice, that's always the challenge, is just being like, hi, and how are you? And I think one way that I've tried to work on that is I took some courses with someone, and they say the person who asks the question has the power of the conversation. So I always found that really easy. Like you're meeting, hi, how are you? What's your name? What do you do? Just keep on asking them stuff. And they may not ask you anything, but by the end, they're like, they really like you. And then they're like, by the way, what do you do? We should do business together. And you didn't even do anything, but you asked them questions for like 20 minutes straight about their life. And they end up walking away feeling like they had such a great conversation, and you didn't have to sell yourself on anything. So I think that's kind of a strategy that I've tried to use if I am in that situation where I need to try to like break the ice, is just ask lots and lots of questions.
Right. Yeah. It's a lesson I need to learn, because I do too much talking.
Yeah. No, same. I'm a customer of it also, but that's something I've tried to learn. There's a book that my mentor at that time had written called Suggestology. And it's all those, conversation tips and tricks to try to like guide the conversation where you want it to go, but through asking all the questions.
What was that called?
It's called Suggestology.
Oh, Suggestology.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to write that one down.
Yeah.
I'm always interested in learning too.
So I have a copy I can lend to you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, your book is great. I already wrote you a Google review already. So I don't know if you saw that already. Yeah. So people can reach you. I've got the link here in case you don't have it in front of you.
I have it. I put together a link tree just to make it easy for people, because there's so many online retailers at this point. So https www.linktr.ee/Serena Holmes author. So SERENA Holmes, HOLMES author. And then you can see like Amazon.ca.com, like Apple Books, Smashwords. There's like a whole long list of the retailers where the book's available, depending on the format that you would want to receive it in.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. It looks great. I'm so proud of you, my great friend. And I love seeing your ongoing success, and can't wait to see you in person at some point.
Same. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much. And hopefully you and your daughter feel so much better soon.
Yeah, I apologize for the sniffles today.
That's okay. I probably would be full of, like actually blowing, but
yeah.
It's the only benefit of being actually isolated in a pandemic is I haven't had a cold since it started. So that's the only thing I'm saying.
Well, I hadn't either, and then all of a sudden we've gotten two really bad ones back to back. So
yeah. Well, hope you feel better. So looking forward to connecting with you again soon. And I guess bye for now.
Thank you.